The world was noise and splinters. One moment, Ethan Cole was standing in line at the teller's window of the Prosperity Bank, the worn leather of his money pouch slick with sweat in his palm. The next, the double doors imploded, ripped from their hinges by a force that shook the floorboards. Men poured in their faces, hidden behind dusty bandanas, their movements swift and predatory. The air, thick with the scent of floor polish and old paper, was instantly corrupted by the metallic tang of gunpowder and a raw animal fear. A shotgun blast tore a chunk from the ceiling, raining plaster dust down like a profane snow on the floor now. The voice was a gravelly roar, a sound that bypassed the ears and settled deep in the gut. Ethan reacted without thought, his body hitting the polished wood along with a dozen others. He felt the hard press of the floor against his cheek, the grain of the planks a sudden, intimate reality. He risked a glance upward. 4 men. Dressed in dark, trail-worn clothes, they moved with a brutal efficiency that spoke of long practice. But it was their leader who held the room in a state of suspended terror. He was a tall, broad-shouldered silhouette against the shattered doorway, a shadow wielding a pair of silver-plated revolvers that seemed to drink the light. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His presence was an anchor pulling all chaos into his orbit. The vault, the leader said, his voice a low command directed at the bank manager, Mr. Abernathy, whose face had gone the color of old parchment. Another man was already behind the counter, sweeping coins and bills into a canvas sack with rough practice scoops. Ethan's mind raced a frantic catalog of his own meager worth. The $30 in his pouch for supplies, the reason he'd come to town, was a loss he could ill afford. But it was a survivable loss. He just needed to stay down, stay still, let the storm pass over him. He pressed his face harder against the floor, trying to make himself smaller, trying to become a part of the woodwork. He thought of Leo back at the ranch alone. The thought was a spike of ice in his chest. The leader gestured with one of his revolvers toward the back wall, where the small brass-plated doors of the safe deposit boxes gleamed. Those too. All of them. A new wave of fear washed through Ethan, cold and sharp, eclipsing everything else. He wasn't thinking of the $30 anymore. He wasn't thinking of the ranch deed tucked away in box number 17. He was thinking of the one thing inside that box that held no monetary value to anyone but him. The one thing that was priceless. Eleanor's locket. The men worked quickly, one of them using a crowbar to pry open the small doors with sickening shrieks of tortured metal. The contents were dumped unceremoniously into a second sack, deeds, wills, a few pieces of jewelry. Ethan could hear the soft clink of metal on metal, and with each sound, the knot in his stomach tightened into a dense, painful stone. He squeezed his eyes shut, as if not seeing it would make it untrue. The robbery felt distant now, an impersonal violence happening to other people. The theft of the locket was an intimate violation, a desecration. The leader walked the line of prone townspeople, his heavy boots echoing on the floor. He stopped near Ethan, who held his breath, the smell of leather and horse sweat filling his nostrils. For a terrifying second, he felt the man's gaze on him, a palpable weight. Then the boots moved on. That's everything, one of the men called from the vault. Let's ride, the leader commanded. They were gone as suddenly as they had appeared, melting back into the blinding afternoon sun, leaving behind a shattered silence. But the smell of gunpowder and a room full of people slowly, cautiously pulling themselves back into a world that no longer felt safe. Ethan remained on the floor a moment longer than the others, the cold of the wood seeping into his bones. When he finally pushed himself up, his movements were stiff, robotic. He looked at the wall of savage deposit boxes, their doors hanging open like mouths frozen in a silent scream. Box 17 was empty. They had taken everything. They had taken her. The ride back to the ranch was a blur of dust and suffocating heat. The $30 he'd saved from the robbery felt like ash in his pocket. He passed fields belonging to other men, fields that were green and thriving, irrigated by creeks that still ran full. He passed the turnoff to Silas Blackwood's sprawling empire, the Double B, marked by an ostentatious arched gate. His own land began where the green gave way to brown, where the earth looked parched and cracked like an old man's skin. The cabin sagged under the weight of the sky, a monument to his failure. It was more than a home. It was a promise he'd made to Eleanor, a promise he was breaking day by day. He dismounted the horse, sighing as if it too felt the weariness of this place. The screen door groaned a familiar complaint as he stepped inside. Leo was at the table, carefully arranging small stones into the shape of a horse. He looked up, his dark eyes wide and questioning. "Did you get the candy, Pa?" The question, so simple and innocent, landed like a punch. He'd promised the boy a piece of horehound candy, a rare treat. The bank, the robbery, the stolen locket, it all swirled in his head, a vortex of despair. He couldn't find the words. He simply shook his head, the motion feeling heavy, leaden. Leo's face fell, but he didn't complain. He had learned not to. He just turned back to his stones, his small shoulders slumped. The silence in the cabin was a living thing, thick with the ghosts of what used to be. It was in the empty chair by the hearth, where Eleanor used to sit and mend their clothes. It was in the faded patch on the wall, where her portrait had hung until he'd sold it for seed money that had yielded nothing. He walked into their small bedroom, the air still and musty. He knelt and pulled a small cedar box from under the bed. Her jewelry box. He opened it. It was empty save for a single pressed wildflower, its petals faded to the color of paper. This was where the locket was supposed to be. This was where it belonged. The memory rose unbidden, as sharp and clear as if it were yesterday. It was their wedding day, standing under the shade of the big pine on the hill. The sun was warm, the air smelled of sap and wild roses. He'd saved for months to buy it. A simple silver oval etched with the shape of a single pine cone, a mirror of the tree that would one day watch over her. He remembered the coolness of the metal in his palm before he fastened it around her neck. He remembered the way she'd touched it, her fingers tracing the etching, her eyes shining with a love so bright it had felt like it could light up the world. "It's so you always have a piece of our home with you," he had whispered to her. Now it was gone. Stolen by a shadow with silver-plated guns tossed into a sack with other meaningless trinkets. It was the last piece of that light, and it had been extinguished. He closed the box, the soft click of the lid sounding like a final definitive end. Grief, an old and familiar companion, settled over him heavier than ever. It was no longer a dull ache. It was a raw, open wound. He was a man hollowed out by loss, haunted by the past, and failing spectacularly in the present. He had nothing left to lose. He was wrong. Days later, the world was still painted in shades of ink and shadow, when a frantic pounding on the door jolted him from a shallow, restless sleep. Leo stirred in his cot, but didn't wake. Ethan grabbed the old rifle he kept by the door and pulled it open to find Gus, the station master, standing on the porch, his face pale and strained in the pre-dawn gloom. Gus was a man who measured the world in timetables and telegrams. His agitation was a sign of a profound derailment. "Ethan," the old man rasped, his voice like gravel rolling downhill. "You best come down to the station. There's a situation." A situation, Ethan's voice was flat devoid of curiosity. His world had narrowed to the ranch, to Leo, and to a cold, simmering obsession with the faceless man who had stolen his past. "What's it got to do with me?" Gus shifted his weight, pulling his collar tight against the chill. "A bride came in on the morning train from San Francisco. A Chinese girl. Trouble is the fella who was supposed to meet her. Well, seems he don't exist." Gus paused, letting the cruelty of it sink in. It was a prank, Ethan. A damn rotten prank. And Silas Blackwood and his boys are down there now treating it like a sideshow. It's getting ugly. Ethan's first instinct was to shut the door. Blackwood. The name left a foul taste in his mouth. He wanted no part of the man's petty tyrannies. He was a spider at the center of a vast web, and Ethan had spent years carefully avoiding its sticky strands. Why come to me, Gus? Because you ain't afraid of him. Gus said, his voice low but insistent. Not really. You just don't want the trouble. And because I reckon that girl ain't got long before Blackwood decides he's got a use for her. He's talking like he owns her, paid her passage. Gus's eyes, roomy in the faint light, held a desperate plea. Just come and see for yourself. A weary sigh escaped Ethan's lips. He was a man consumed with his own private war, with his secret inquiries in town about the robbers, his fruitless searches for any sign of the locket. He had no time or energy for the troubles of a stranger. But the image Gus painted, a lone woman at the mercy of a pack of wolves, pricked at something dormant inside him. A rusty mechanism of conscience he thought had seized up long ago. The train station was just as Gus described. A small crowd had gathered on the wooden platform, their faces illuminated by a handful of swinging lanterns, their voices a low murmur of jeers and sharp-edged laughter. At the center of it all she stood. She was small, wrapped in a dark blue silk tunic that seemed to shimmer even in the poor light. Her black hair was pinned up with an elegant precision that was a world away from this dusty, spiteful corner of the territory. She stood ramrod straight beside a single, intricately carved wooden trunk, her posture a silent, defiant testament to a dignity they were trying to dismantle piece by piece. Look at her, Silas Blackwood's voice boomed thick with whiskey and malice. He was a big man, made bigger by a long duster and a wide-brimmed hat. Came all the way across the ocean for a wedding that ain't happening. Someone sent Silas a mail-order prize. His men, a half-dozen rough-looking ranch hands, roared with laughter. "What's she good for, boss?" one of them jeered. "She even speak English." "Doubt it." Blackwood sneered, spitting a stream of tobacco juice that landed dangerously close to her small cloth-soled shoes. "But she'll learn what's expected of her." The young woman kept her chin high, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond their leering faces. But Ethan, standing at the edge of the crowd, saw the slight tremor in her hands, clasped tightly in front of her. He saw the fear in her dark eyes, sharp and raw as an open wound. He saw a soul cornered and terrified, holding itself together by a single fraying thread of pride. He felt a flicker of the old anger, the protective fire he thought had died with Eleanor. He saw his own powerlessness from the bank robbery reflected in her hopeless eyes. And in that moment, an idea reckless, insane, and utterly ruinous took root. He cleared his throat, and the sound cut through the noise with surprising authority. "What's the trouble here, Silas?" The crowd shifted, turning to face him. Blackwood's smile became a predatory smirk. "No trouble, Cole. Just admiring the new arrival. Seems her groom got cold feet. In fact, seems he never existed at all." Her eyes met Ethan's then. It was a fleeting glance, but in it he saw a desperate, silent plea. "So what happens to her now?" Ethan asked, his voice steady, ignoring the hostile stares. "Well," Blackwood said, taking a proprietary step toward her, "seeing as I'm the one who paid her passage as a little joke for one of my boys, I figure she belongs to me now. I'll find some work for her up at my place." The insinuation hung thick and poisonous in the air, and the men snickered. A cold fury rose in Ethan, pure and cleansing. He stepped forward, moving through the crowd, until he stood directly between Blackwood and the woman. "She doesn't belong to you. Blackwood Ethan said, his voice ringing with a conviction that surprised even himself. She's not going anywhere with you. Blackwood's face darkened. And who's going to stop me, you Cole? You can't even keep your own ranch from turning to dust. That may be, Ethan said calmly. But you won't be laying a hand on her. Because she has a place to go. He turned to the woman, his voice softening slightly, speaking slowly and clearly. I have a place. A home. Her eyes widened, a flicker of confusion and suspicion warring with the desperation. Blackwood let out a roar of laughter. Taking in strays now, Cole. What are you going to do? Make her your new housekeeper? The reckless idea bloomed fully formed. It was an act of defiance aimed at Blackwood, at the town, at the crushing weight of his own solitary life. It was a move that would complicate everything, make him a direct enemy of the most powerful man in the territory, and jeopardize his secret investigation. He didn't care. No, Ethan said, the words falling into the stunned silence. He looked directly at the woman, whose expression was one of complete bewilderment. I'm going to marry her. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Gus's jaw dropped. Blackwood's face twisted in disbelief, then rage. You're bluffing. Am I? Ethan held out his hand to the woman in offering. He didn't know if she'd understand his words, but he hoped she'd understand the intent. My name is Ethan Cole. I can offer you my name and my protection. It's not much, but it's honest. She stared at his outstretched hand, calloused and dirt-stained. Then she looked at his face, searching his eyes for any hint of the cruelty or deceit she'd seen in the others. She saw the hardness there, the deep grooves of sorrow, but she saw no malice. After a long, tense moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Then she placed her hand in his. Her hand was small and surprisingly strong. Right then, Ethan set his voice firm as he turned to the thunderstruck crowd. We're heading to the preacher's. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me right now. No one moved. Blackwood looked as if he might explode, but for once, he was speechless, caught flat-footed by a move he could never have anticipated. Ethan, ignoring the burning stares, hoisted her wooden trunk onto his other shoulder. Come on, he said gently to her. Best we get this done. As they walked away from the station, her steps light, but determined beside him, Ethan felt something shift inside him. He had just bound himself to a woman whose name he didn't even know, a stranger from a world away. It was a reckless gambit born of impulse and a forgotten sense of decency. He didn't know if it was the smartest or the most foolish thing he had ever done. But for the first time in 2 years, he felt like he was moving forward, not just surviving. Her name, he learned, was Mei Lin. She wrote it for him in the dust on the cabin floor with a slender finger, the characters beautiful and strange, a script from another world. The first few days were a study in silence, a delicate, awkward dance of gestures and tentative smiles. The cabin, which had always felt empty and cavernous, with just him and Leo, now seemed to contract around this new, quiet presence. The scent of her herbal tea, a subtle earthy aroma, mingled with the familiar smell of wood smoke and dust, changing the very air he breathed. Mei Lin moved with a quiet grace that was a stark contrast to the rough-hewn surroundings. She rose before the sun, her motions efficient and noiseless. She found a rhythm in the chores without ever being asked, her hands, though clearly unaccustomed to such hard labor, never idle. The space began to change. A pile of dusty rags became neatly folded squares. The chaotic jumble of pots and pans found a new logical order. Small, almost invisible acts of organization that began to impose a gentle sense of calm on their hardscrabble existence. Leo was her bridge to this new world. He was fascinated by her, following her around the homestead with a child's boundless curiosity, a chattering guide to his small universe. He pointed at things, announcing their names proudly. Chicken, he'd say, holding up a freshly gathered egg. Goat, he'd shout as he led their stubborn nanny to the pen. Mei Lin would repeat the words softly, her pronunciation careful, a small, encouraging smile gracing her lips. In return, she taught him things without words. She showed him how to weave reeds from the creek into a small, sturdy basket, and how to find wild mint near the pine trees, crushing the leaves between her fingers to release the fragrant scent. Ethan watched them from a distance, a knot of something complex and unfamiliar tightening in his chest. He had married her to protect her, a grand, defiant gesture. He had not expected the quiet way she would begin to mend the broken pieces of his life. He remained focused, his mind a constant churn of the robbery of the locket. He rode out often, using the excuse of checking snares or hunting to discreetly ask questions in the outlying homesteads. He spoke to a farrier about the robbers' horses, trying to find a detail, any detail that might lead him somewhere. He'd return late, covered in dust, his frustration a palpable aura. Mei Lin would have a plate of warm food waiting for him, her dark eyes watching him, always watching, as if trying to read the language of his soul, since she could not understand his tongue. Her steady presence was both a comfort and a complication. Her suspicion about his long absences was a quiet question mark that hung in the air between them. The damming of the creek was an act of slow, deliberate strangulation. It began subtly. The trickle of water that fed their small vegetable patch and watered their meager livestock thinned, then slowed to a muddy crawl. Ethan followed the creek bed upstream, his boots sinking into the damp earth until he found the cause. A crudely constructed dam of rocks and logs, fresh axe marks scarring the timber. It was on Blackwood's land, a clear and undeniable act of aggression. There was no mistaking the message. This is my land. This is my water. You exist because I allow it. Anger, cold and hard, settled in Ethan's stomach. This was a different kind of violence than the quick brutality of the bank robbery. This was a siege. He spent 2 days clearing a portion of the dam, his muscles screaming in protest, only to find it rebuilt and reinforced the following week. The ranch was dying of thirst. It was during this slow-motion crisis that Mei Lin stepped out of the shadows of their silent arrangement and became a partner. She saw the despair etched on his face when he returned, his clothes soaked with sweat and mud. That evening, she led him to a small shaded patch of land behind the cabin he'd always ignored. Using a stick, she drew a series of channels in the dirt, pointing from the roof of the cabin to the struggling garden, and then making a gesture of falling rain. It was a simple, ingenious plan to capture what little rainwater they might get. They worked together, digging the shallow trenches, their shared purpose, forging a bond stronger than words. Their fragile new life was tested again when Leo fell ill. A fever took hold of him quickly, leaving him pale and shivering under a mountain of blankets. The town doctor was a full day's ride away, a journey Leo was too weak to make. Panic, cold and familiar, gripped Ethan. He saw Eleanor in his mind's eye, her breath growing shallow, her skin hot to the touch. He felt the same helplessness, the same impotent rage against a foe he could not fight with his fists or his gun. He was sitting by Leo's cot, wiping the boy's forehead with a damp rag, when Mei Lin returned from the woods. She carried a bundle of leaves and roots wrapped in a piece of cloth. She worked at the hearth, crushing the herbs with a stone, her movements focused and sure. Soon, a pungent medicinal aroma filled the cabin. She brought a steaming cup of the brew to the cot, and with a gentle murmur coaxed Leo into drinking the bitter liquid. She made a cool poultice from the mashed leaves and laid it on his forehead. Ethan watched, a skeptical observer, but said nothing. For 2 days, she barely slept, constantly tending to the boy, brewing the tea, changing the poultices. On the third morning, the fever broke. Leo woke up weak, but clear-eyed, asking for a drink of water. Relief washed over Ethan so powerfully, his knees felt weak. He looked at Mei Lin, who was asleep in a chair by the fire, her face exhausted but peaceful. She had saved his son with a knowledge that came from a world away, a knowledge more valuable than any doctor's fee he could never afford. That night, as she prepared to teach him how to load and fire the old shotgun, a necessity he could no longer put off, their dynamic had irrevocably shifted. The weapon felt heavy and awkward in her small hands, but she held it with a surprising steadiness. "You pull this back," he said, his hand covering hers on the hammer, his voice rough. "Then you aim. You squeeze, don't pull." She nodded, her focus absolute. As they stood there in the fading light, the scent of gunpowder and wild mint clinging to the air, she looked up at him and spoke her broken English, pieced together with effort. "Where you go, long time? You look for trouble?" The directness of the question startled him. He had grown accustomed to the comfortable veil of their silence. He looked into her intelligent, questioning eyes and found he couldn't lie. He didn't tell her about the locket, about the raw, personal nature of his quest. That was a grief too deep, too private to share. But he told her about the robbery, about the masked men, about his need to find them. "They take much money?" she asked. He shook his head. "They took something that belonged to my wife." The admission hung in the air between them, the first crack in the wall he had built around his heart. She didn't press for more. She simply nodded, a silent understanding passing between them. From that day on, she was no longer just a suspicious observer of his absences. She was a silent ally. When he rode out, she would hand him a small packet of dried herbs for energy. When he returned empty-handed, she would meet his unspoken frustration with a quiet cup of tea. Their shared battles against Blackwood's malice, against the land's indifference, against sickness and poverty, were weaving their disparate lives together, thread by painful thread. His investigation, meanwhile, was yielding frustratingly little. The robbers had vanished as if into thin air. But then a sliver of a lead. He was in the saloon, nursing a cheap whiskey, when he overheard two of Blackwood's ranch hands talking. One of them, a loudmouth named Jeb, was boasting about a new silver watch he'd bought. Ethan knew for a fact that ranch hands on Blackwood's payroll didn't make the kind of money that bought new silver watches. Later, he sought out the blacksmith, a gnarled old man named Peterson. Feigning interest in getting a new shoe for his horse, he described an unusual mark he'd seen on the trail, a horseshoe with a nick in the left side. Peterson grunted, not looking up from his anvil. "Sounds like one of Blackwood's prize stallions. Puts a nick in all their shoes himself. Claims it's for luck." A horseshoe, a silver watch. It wasn't much, but it was a pattern. The whispers pointed toward the double B. The idea that Blackwood, a man who owned half the territory, would be involved in a common bank robbery seemed absurd. And yet, the pieces were there. He needed proof. He needed to get inside Blackwood's office. The night was moonless, a thick blanket of cloud smothering the stars. Ethan left the ranch on foot, a crowbar tucked into his belt, the cold iron, a grim weight against his side. The Blackwood ranch was a fortress, its sprawling main house a dark monolith against the horizon. He moved through the shadows, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He was not a thief. The unfamiliar act of stealth, of breaking and entering, felt like a betrayal of his own nature. But the image of the locket, cold and alone in a robber's sack, spurred him on. The office window was unlocked. He slid it open with a soft groan of wood on wood and slipped inside. The room smelled of leather, cigar smoke, and money. A massive oak desk dominated the space, its surface neat and orderly. He worked quickly, his fingers fumbling with the drawer pulls. The first drawer held ledgers. The second held whiskey and glasses. The third was locked. He used the crowbar, grimacing at the loud crack of splintering wood as the lock gave way. Inside, there were stacks of currency, more money than Ethan had seen in his life. But he wasn't looking for money. His fingers searched the corners of the drawer, hoping for the cool, smooth curve of the locket. Nothing. His heart sank. He had been wrong. It was a dead end. Defeated, he started to close the drawer, but his fingers brushed against a small, flat object tucked beneath a stack of papers. He pulled it out. It was a photograph, its edges worn and soft. He held it up to the faint light filtering through the window, and the air left his lungs in a single silent gasp. It was a picture of a younger, happier Silas Blackwood. And standing beside him, her hand resting on his arm, her face radiant with a smile that Ethan knew better than his own, was Eleanor. His Eleanor. He turned the photograph over his hands, trembling. On the back, in her elegant, familiar script, was an inscription, "To my dear brother Silas, with love, Ellie." Brother. The word detonated in the silence of his mind, shattering his understanding of the world. Silas Blackwood was not just a greedy landowner, not just a cruel bully. He was Eleanor's brother. Every cruel joke, every act of aggression, every sneer and threat was instantly recontextualized. This wasn't about land. It wasn't about water. It was personal. It had always been personal. The question shifted, spinning him into a dizzying new reality. The mystery was no longer who the villain was, but why his wife's own brother hated him enough to destroy him. The confrontation came 2 days later. Ethan was repairing a fence line at the edge of his property when Blackwood rode up alone. The pretense was gone. The casual malice in Blackwood's eyes had been replaced by something harder, something ancient and full of poisonous grief. "You've been a busy man," Cole Blackwood said, his voice deceptively calm. He didn't dismount, looking down at Ethan from the back of his prize stallion, the one with the nicked horseshoes. "Snooping around my office." Ethan didn't deny it. He straightened up the fencing tool heavy in his hand. "You're her brother." It wasn't a question. A flicker of something pain, perhaps, crossed Blackwood's face before it hardened again into a mask of contempt. "She was my sister. My baby sister. And you killed her." The accusation was so monstrous, so insane, that Ethan could only stare. "She died of a fever. You know that." "A fever," Blackwood spat the words. "She died of pride. Your pride. I begged her to leave this dust bowl. I begged her to come live at the ranch with me, where she'd be comfortable, where she'd be safe. I could have gotten her the best doctors from the city when she fell ill. But no, she wouldn't leave you. And you were too proud to let her go. Too proud to admit you'd failed. You'd rather be king of this scrap heap than see your wife live." Each word was a hammer blow crafted to inflict maximum pain. Blackwood leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You didn't just let her get sick. You let her die in the dust, Cole. You watched her fade away in that miserable shack because you couldn't swallow your damn pride and ask for my help." Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. The accusation was a twisted version of his own deepest fears, the guilt that gnawed at him in the dead of night. Had he been too proud? Could he have saved her if he'd just given up? The doubt was a poison seeping into the cracks of his grief. "What do you want?" Blackwood Ethan asked, his voice hoarse. Blackwood laughed a harsh, broken sound. I want you to feel what I felt. I want you to understand what it is to have the most precious thing in your life torn away from you. I'm going to take this ranch. I'm going to wipe every trace of you from this valley. And I'm going to do it slowly so you can watch it all turn to ash. He paused, his eyes glittering with a terrible light. But first, I think I'll take something to prove my point. He spurred his horse, riding off not toward his own ranch, but back toward Ethan's cabin. A cold dread, sharper and more terrifying than anything he had ever known, seized Ethan. He dropped the tool and ran, his lungs burning, his mind screaming one name: Leo. He was too late. When he burst into the clearing, the cabin door was wide open. The small stone horse Leo had been building was scattered across the floor. Of his son, there was no sign. Blackwood had taken him. He had taken the one thing Ethan could not bear to lose again. The sky was turning a bruised, sickly yellow. A monstrous wall of red dust was building on the western horizon, a storm rolling in with the speed and fury of a charging beast. The wind began to howl, whipping sand into Ethan's face, stinging his eyes. It was a fitting backdrop for the end of the world. He was checking his rifle, his movements frantic and clumsy, when Mei Lin came out of the cabin. She carried the shotgun in one hand and a small, tightly wrapped bundle in the other. Her face was set, her eyes reflecting the storm's chaotic energy. "I go," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," Ethan said, his voice raw. "This is my fight. He has my son." "Our son," she corrected him, her voice fierce and unwavering. She thrust the bundle into his hands. It was bread and dried meat. A canteen was slung over her shoulder. "You not go alone." He looked at her, this woman, who had become the center of his collapsing world, and saw a strength that mirrored his own desperation. He gave a single sharp nod. There was no time to argue. They rode into the teeth of the storm. The wind shrieked, visibility dropped to near zero, and the air grew thick with choking red sand. The world became a disorienting vortex of noise and grit. It was a nightmare landscape, chaotic and hellish. They found the main gate of the Double B Ranch, torn from its hinges, swinging wildly in the gale. The ranch hands were scattered, trying to wrangle panicked livestock as the storm descended. The chaos was their cover. They left the horses and crept toward the main house, using the howling wind to mask their approach. It was not a simple shootout. It was a desperate infiltration. Two of Blackwood's men spotted them emerging like phantoms from the dust. Gunfire erupted, sharp cracks lost in the roar of the wind. Ethan fired his shot, finding its mark. Mei Lin, bracing herself against a porch column, fired the shotgun, its blast, a deafening roar that sent the second man sprawling. They breached the house. Inside, the storm's fury was a muffled roar. Lanterns swayed, casting long, dancing shadows. Ethan moved from room to room, his rifle at the ready, his heart a cold, hard lump of ice in his chest. "Leo," he roared, his voice swallowed by the house. He found Blackwood in the grand parlor, standing before a massive stone fireplace. He was not alone. Leo stood beside him, his small face pale with terror. Blackwood's large hand resting possessively on his shoulder. "I told you I'd make you understand," Cole Blackwood said, his voice eerily calm amidst the raging storm outside. He held up his other hand. Dangling from his fingers, twisting in the lantern light, was the silver locket. The bank robbery was never about money. It was about this. The last piece of her you had. The last piece of her you didn't deserve. Rage, pure and blinding, threatened to overwhelm Ethan. He raised his rifle. "I wouldn't," Blackwood warned, his fingers tightening on Leo's shoulder. "I just want to talk." At that moment, Mei Lin appeared in the doorway behind Ethan. Her face was smudged with dirt, her hair wild, but her eyes were clear and focused. She had been silent, an observer. But now she spoke, her voice cutting through the tension with shocking clarity, her English perfect and unaccented. "He is not in the cellar," she said. Ethan and Blackwood both turned to stare at her. "I heard two men talking outside before the storm hit," she continued, her voice steady and strong. "They said, the old storm cellar is too damp. The boss said to put the boy in the dry pantry next to the kitchen." The revelation was a double-edged sword. First, the location of his son. Second, the stunning truth of Mei Lin herself. The broken English, the quiet deference. It had been a mask, a shield she used to survive, in a world that saw her as a fragile doll. She was more than a dependent. She was a partner, a warrior in her own right. Blackwood's face contorted in fury at the betrayal. In that split second of distraction, Ethan saw his chance. It was not a choice between revenge and justice. It was a choice between the past and the future. Killing Blackwood would be an ending. Saving Leo was a beginning. He didn't fire at Blackwood's heart. He fired at his shoulder. The rifle cracked and Blackwood cried out, stumbling back, his grip on Leo loosening. Ethan lunged forward, sweeping his son into his arms, shielding him with his body as he backed away. "It's over, Silas," Ethan said, his voice heavy with the weight of it all. "It's finally over." When the dust storm subsided, it left behind a world scrubbed clean and unnaturally quiet. The sheriff, a weary but decent man named Miller, arrived with a posse drawn by the sounds of the fight. They found Blackwood wounded and defeated, his men rounded up. The truth, when it came out, was a torrent. The story of the locket, of a brother's twisted grief, turning to villainy, of the kidnapping, spread through the valley. Back in town, the cold shoulders Ethan had grown accustomed to were replaced with hands patting his back with offers of help. The townspeople who had once seen him as a sullen failure now saw a man who had fought a monster to protect his family. They helped him rebuild the dam, their shovels digging into the earth alongside his. In the quiet days that followed, Mei Lin's full story was revealed. She was not a poor peasant girl sold into marriage, but the daughter of a scholarly family from a coastal city. Her family had lost everything in a political upheaval, and she had taken a desperate gamble to find passage to a new world using the guise of a mail-order bride as her only means of escape. Her intelligence and resilience were not accidents of nature. They were the products of a life and an education Ethan could barely imagine. She spoke of her home of books and art, and as she spoke, the last pieces of the puzzle of who she was clicked into place. She was not a victim he had saved. She was a survivor who had saved him right back. Months later, the ranch was showing signs of new life. The creek ran full and clear, and green shoots pushed their way through the dark, damp soil in the garden. Autumn was painting the hillsides in strokes of gold and crimson. The final scene took place on the hill beneath the lone pine, whose branches swayed in the gentle breeze. Ethan stood before Eleanor's grave, the simple wooden cross he had carved for her, now weathered and gray. Mei Lin stood beside him, her hand resting in the crook of his arm. Leo stood between them, holding each of their hands. In his palm, Ethan held the recovered silver locket. It felt both heavy and weightless, a tangible link to a life that was no longer his. For a long time, he just looked at it, the etched pine cone, a faint, silvery ghost. He thought he would put it back in the cedar box, a treasured memory to be locked away. But he knew now that the past was not a thing to be hoarded in a dark box. It was a place to be visited, honored, and respectfully left behind. With his heel, he dug a small hole in the soft earth at the base of the gravestone. He placed the locket inside, the silver gleaming against the dark soil, and covered it over. He was leaving it with her where it belonged. He was letting go. He stood up and took Mayleen's hand, their fingers lacing together naturally comfortably. A new family forged in the crucible of tragedy and resilience. The final surprise was a quiet, emotional moment, as soft as the setting sun. Leo, who had been learning from Mei Lin every day, let go of their hands, pointed a small finger toward the brilliant horizon, and spoke a single clear word in Chinese. Mei Lin smiled a gentle, lovely expression that lit up her whole face. She squeezed Ethan's hand and said the English word back to her student. Sunset. Ethan watched them, his son and his wife, their two worlds merging into one under the vast painted sky. He was no longer a man defined by what he had lost. He was a man defined by what he had found. It was a quiet, hopeful image of a new beginning.